The forbidden city slept under a thin veil of winter mist. Its red lacquered gates loomed silent in the pre-dawn stillness, while frost clung to the dragon-shaped tiles like pale breath on cold metal. Deep within the palace, a figure moved without sound, a shadow sliding across corridors gilded in moonlight. His felt-soled shoes made no noise on the polished floor, even the lantern in his hand barely swayed. The court was not yet awake. The emperor still slept in the hall of heavenly purity, and the concubines in their perfumed chambers dreamed in silk-wrapped darkness. But the eunuch walked with purpose, his mind already alive with the day's hidden currents, which ministers would seek audience, which concubines would send secret notes, and which rumors he would need to smother before the emperor's ears caught them. For outsiders, eunuchs were the emperor's faceless servants, mute, submissive, stripped of manhood and family lineage. But here, inside the most guarded walls in China, they were more than servants. They were gatekeepers. No one reached the Son of Heaven without passing through the quiet filter of a eunuch's gaze. It was a paradox as old as the empire itself. Men made powerless in body were granted power over the most dangerous thing in the court, access. They carried imperial seals, opened letters, whispered state secrets, and poured tea for those who ruled. And in a world where proximity to the throne could decide life or death, a single glance from a favored eunuch could turn a courtier into an ally, or a corpse. Tonight, as the eunuch glided past the lacquered doors of the inner court, he allowed himself a moment to pause. From the far side of the courtyard came the faint sound of muffled weeping. Perhaps another concubine had learned she would not be summoned this month. Or perhaps news from the outer world had slipped past the guards, news of famine, of uprisings, of a border army's defeat. These things would not reach the emperor until the eunuchs decided he was ready to hear them. The position was not born of kindness. It was born of necessity. In the ancient Chinese court, the emperor's harem and private chambers were forbidden to all men except those who could never sire children, those who could never seed rivals to the imperial bloodline. Eunuchs were, in theory, safe. In practice, they became the only men who could stand at the empress's side without fear of scandal, the only ones who could carry her words to the emperor without suspicion. That safety became influence. Influence became power. History remembered them in extremes. There were eunuchs like Wei Zhongxian of the late Ming dynasty, whose control over the court was so absolute that ministers trembled at his name. And there were those whose names no one bothered to write down, men who polished the floors of the palace for 50 years and died without ceremony. Both walked the same corridors, both lived under the same silent rules. The eunuch in the frostlit corridor, let us call him Cheng, had long ago learned that survival here depended not on loyalty to the emperor alone, but on understanding the endless game being played behind painted screens. It was a game of messages carried at the right hour, of favors traded for silence, of listening more than speaking. He remembered the day he was brought here, the iron bars of the gate closing behind him, the smell of incense and ink, the eyes of older eunuchs assessing him like a merchant sizes up a jewel. He had been 14, a farmer's son. His family had been promised a small stipend for his service, a poor man's gamble that one of their own might rise to imperial favor. The operation had been done quickly, cruelly, and without ceremony. He woke feverish, half dead, but with one truth burned into him: his life now belonged entirely to the palace. Years later, that truth still bound him. He had no wife, no children, no surname that could be passed down. But he had the ear of the Empress Dowager. He could slip a warning into the emperor's morning tea if a minister plotted against him. He could make a visiting envoy wait in the cold for hours, or guide him straight to the throne room, depending on whose coin or gratitude was more valuable. Tonight, as dawn began to pale the sky beyond the crimson walls, Cheng reached the emperor's private study. He set down the lantern, lit the brazier, and arranged the scrolls for the morning's readings. The air smelled faintly of sandalwood and cold ink. Soon, the emperor would enter, yawning perhaps, or irritable, depending on what dreams had visited him. Cheng would bow, speak softly, and vanish before the emperor even finished his tea. But the eunuch's influence was not in being seen. It was in what he saw, what he carried in memory. The emperor might believe he ruled the Middle Kingdom by mandate of heaven, but in the long shadow of the dragon throne, it was men like Cheng who decided which truths heaven allowed him to know. And so, when the first bell of the morning tolled, the court awoke to another day of ceremonies, petitions, and invisible negotiations. The frost began to melt from the roof tiles. Somewhere, in the hall of eternal spring, a concubine prepared her finest smile for a summons that might never come. And Cheng, the silent shadow, watched it all unfold with the practiced calm of a man who knew that in this palace, whispers carried farther than shouts. Long before a boy like Cheng could glide through the imperial corridors with the poise of a court veteran, his path began in places far from the silk and gold of the Forbidden City. Many eunuchs came from the outer provinces, sons of farmers, laborers, or failed scholars, plucked from obscurity by poverty, desperation, or political necessity. The journey from village earth to palace marble was neither gentle nor voluntary for most. In ancient China, the act that defined them, the castration, was carried out with little care for dignity. In early dynasties, the procedure was a punishment for crimes, meant to mark the offender as both dishonored and permanently barred from lineage. By the Ming and Qing periods, however, it had become a gateway to a peculiar form of opportunity. For some families drowning in debt, sending a son to be castrated and offered to the palace was a grim investment, a gamble that he might rise high enough to send gifts or stipends home. The operation was brutal. In the Ming era, both the penis and testicles were removed in a single cut, leaving the body to be sealed with a plug until the wound healed. The eunuch's treasure, the severed parts, was preserved in a jar of alcohol, to be buried with him upon death. Without it, the soul was believed to wander restless in the afterlife, incomplete. Many died from infection, blood loss, or fever in the days after. Those who survived emerged into a life that was neither entirely male nor wholly outside manhood, existing in a narrow social space defined by service, silence, and constant observation. Cheng had been 14 when his father agreed to the arrangement. A minor drought had ruined their crops, and the family owed grain tax they could not pay. An old recruiter, a retired palace eunuch with a limp, had visited the village, whispering of wages, fine clothes, and a life in the emperor's service. Cheng's mother wept. His father avoided his eyes. Within a month, he was taken to the castration chamber, its floor slick with water and ash. The pain was blinding, but the deeper wound was the knowledge that the boy who had stepped inside would never leave as himself again. Those who survived the knife entered the first gate of their new world, the training halls of the Eunuch Academy. Here, the palace stripped them of their old names and gave them short, functional ones, Cheng, Lu, and easy to call, easy to forget. The training was rigid, walking with silent steps, bowing at the correct angle, speaking only when spoken to. Days were filled with memorizing ceremonial protocols, learning the intricate palace geography, and understanding the subtle hierarchies between different departments. A eunuch's worth lay in obedience, but advancement required more. The inner court valued discretion above all else. A tongue that wagged could cost a head. Apprentices learned to read faces as deftly as others read books, to see when an official's smile hid resentment, when a concubine's laughter carried spite. They practiced keeping their own expressions as calm as still water, never letting a flicker of emotion betray their thoughts. Not all training was ceremonial. The palace was a labyrinth of factions, bureaucrats in the outer court, concubines in the inner court, and the ever-shifting loyalties between them. Senior eunuchs taught the novices which ministers could be trusted, which concubines were dangerous, and how to survive when two powerful patrons made opposite demands. The lesson was always the same: never take a side unless you are certain it will win. Life in the lower ranks was harsh. Novice eunuchs slept in communal dormitories, rising before dawn to sweep courtyards or polish bronze vessels until their arms ached. Meals were plain rice and watery broth. Any misstep, a dropped porcelain dish, a late arrival to a ceremony, could earn a beating from a superior. Many did not last long, some fled, some were expelled, and some vanished in ways no one dared discuss. But for those who endured, the rewards were tangible. A favored eunuch might be granted silk robes, private quarters, and the right to handle imperial documents. A few rose high enough to control entire departments, overseeing the emperor's personal treasury, directing palace construction projects, or managing the imperial kitchens. And at the very pinnacle stood the chief eunuch, the emperor's most trusted shadow, whose whispered advice could sway imperial decrees. Cheng, like others, began at the bottom. For years, he fetched water, scrubbed floors, and carried messages between minor officials. His first glimpse of the emperor came only after 3 years of service, when he was chosen to stand at the edge of the Hall of Supreme Harmony during a New Year ceremony. The sight of the Son of Heaven, resplendent in dragon robes beneath the vermilion roof, struck him like a vision from legend. But even then, Cheng knew, his work was not to bask in that light, but to remain unseen while ensuring it burned without interruption. By the time he turned 20, Cheng had mastered the art of invisibility, gliding through rooms without drawing eyes, listening without seeming to hear. That skill, more than any formal rank, was what earned him a place in the emperor's household department. It was here, in the shadowed antechambers of power, that he began to understand the true nature of a eunuch's life, not as a servant of one master, but as a silent navigator of the currents that ran beneath the empire's glittering surface. By the time Cheng entered the emperor's household department, he had learned that a eunuch's survival did not depend on strength of body, most had lost that long ago, but on strength of perception. The household department was the beating heart of the palace's private life, the place where meals were ordered, robes laid out, petitions filtered, and messages from the emperor's family passed in discreet silence. It was also a place where a misplaced word could topple a career, or a life. The inner palace was not merely a residence, it was a theater in perpetual performance. At its center was the emperor, the Son of Heaven, surrounded by an orbit of wives, consorts, and favored concubines, each backed by family clans who waited beyond the vermilion gates for a chance at influence. The eunuchs of the household department were the quiet stagehands in this play, controlling who approached, what was seen, and what was heard. In their hands, the simplest decision, whether to deliver a note immediately or to misplace it for a day, could shift the balance of favor. For Cheng, the first lesson in this art came from an older eunuch named Gao Shun, whose thin frame and stooped shoulders disguised the fact that he had outlasted 3 emperors. One winter evening, Gao beckoned Cheng into a shadowed corner of the laundry court. "Watch carefully," he said, producing 2 silk handkerchiefs. One was flawless, white as snow. The other bore a faint stain, barely visible unless turned in the light. If the Empress Dowager asks for a handkerchief, you give her the clean one. If a concubine asks, you give her the stained one. She will believe it is the best we have for her, and she will remember the slight. It was a lesson in more than cloth. Everything in the palace was an exchange of signals, small and deliberate. A bowed head might mean loyalty, or it might mean concealment. A gift could be generosity, or a warning. Eunuchs like Gao survived by deciding which meanings to let bloom and which to quietly strangle before they took root. Qing soon realized that this invisible network of favors and slights extended far beyond the women's quarters. The outer court, home to ministers, military commanders, and bureaucrats, relied on eunuchs as the emperor's most direct channel. The ministers could draft memorials and petitions, but the path from their inkstone to the emperor's eyes always passed through a eunuch's hands. The wrong scroll could be left at the bottom of a stack. The right one could be placed on top, folded just so, to catch the emperor's attention before breakfast. This subtle power was not without danger. History whispered constantly in the palace halls, and its lessons were carved deep. Every eunuch knew the story of Wei Zhongxian of the late Ming dynasty, once the most powerful man in the empire, who rose by mastering court factions and fell when the tide turned, leaving his name cursed for centuries. His story was a warning: power borrowed from the emperor could be reclaimed in an instant. And yet, the temptation was always there. The palace was a living organism of rivalries, empress against concubine, minister against minister, clans against clans. Eunuchs stood at the meeting points of these conflicts, often courted by both sides. Gifts flowed quietly: a lacquer box filled with tea leaves from a governor's estate, a bolt of embroidered silk from a concubine's family, a pouch of silver hidden inside a delivery of candles. Most were accepted without comment. To refuse too pointedly might offend, to accept too openly might condemn. The skill lay in making the acceptance seem like mere politeness, never an agreement. One spring, Cheng was entrusted with delivering an imperial decree to the Ministry of Rites. It was a small matter, an adjustment to the schedule of the Lantern Festival ceremonies, but Gao Shan stopped him at the gate. "Walk slowly," he advised. "If they receive it today, the Grand Secretary will gain the credit. If they receive it tomorrow, the Minister of Rites will claim it. Which one will remember your name more kindly?" Qing hesitated, then carried the scroll through the market district, stopping for tea before arriving at the ministry's offices just before they closed for the day. By morning, the Minister of Rites was all smiles when Qing next passed through the gate. These were the threads on which the palace was woven: delays that were not delays, mistakes that were not mistakes, and silences that said more than words ever could. For the emperor, the eunuchs were loyal shadows, obedient, discreet, indispensable. But among themselves, they knew the truth: survival was not in obeying every command, but in knowing which commands would be forgotten, and which would be remembered forever. Qing, still young, walked this path with care. But already, in the corners of his mind, he began to imagine what could be built if a man, not quite a man, learned to pull those threads not only for survival, but for power. In the Forbidden City, words were only the surface of meaning. Beneath them ran an entire ocean of signals, glances, and ritualized movements, an unspoken code that only those who lived long within the vermilion walls could understand. For eunuchs, mastering this silent language was as important as learning to read an imperial edict. The rules were not written anywhere. They were inherited, like the scent of incense on old silk. When a high-ranking consort asked, "Has His Majesty dined well today?" she was rarely inquiring about the emperor's appetite. The answer she sought might reveal whether he had visited her rival's chambers the night before, whether the kitchen had sent a particular dish associated with a certain consort's family, or whether his mood was light enough to risk a personal request. A single raised eyebrow from a eunuch could tell her more than an entire scroll of words. Even the way a eunuch walked carried meaning. A measured pace down the eastern corridor could imply the emperor was at leisure, receiving no officials. A brisk step toward the western pavilion might indicate an urgent audience with a favored minister. A pause beneath the shade of the cypress trees could be a discreet invitation for a court lady to approach and speak privately. Qing learned these subtleties from observation, not instruction. Gao Shan never explained outright, for such things could not be taught in the way of reading or calligraphy. One had to feel them. Cheng would watch the older eunuchs serving tea in the hall of mental cultivation, noting how they would hold the teapots slightly higher for the emperor's cup than for the grand empress dowager's, how the soft clink of porcelain could signal impatience, how a silent refill could convey sympathy without a word. And yet, this language was not only for the court's elite. Eunuchs spoke it among themselves, especially when danger was near. In the laundry yard, a casually dropped towel might mean, "The inspector is coming, hide the gifts." A half-folded robe laid on a windowsill could signal, "The Empress Dowager's temper is high, do not bring her bad news." It was a survival mechanism in a world where walls had ears and even a breath could be reported. One evening, while carrying a message from the emperor's study to the Ministry of War offices within the palace, Cheng passed through the pavilion of literary profundity. There, an older eunuch polishing the floor tiles caught his gaze for just a second, eyes narrowing slightly, then flicking to a shadowed alcove. Cheng slowed, feigning to adjust his robes, and from the corner of his vision saw two junior eunuchs lurking, their ears straining toward the closed doors of the emperor's private meeting. Without a word, Cheng took a longer route. Later that night, Gao Shun told him those same junior eunuchs had been dismissed for repeating what they overheard. This secret tongue was not free of danger. Misreading a signal could be fatal. A eunuch who mistook an impatient gesture for permission to speak might be accused of insolence. One who failed to deliver a coded warning could be blamed for a disaster that followed. The palace rewarded those who understood without being told, and punished those who had to ask. Beyond survival, however, this language offered opportunity. A message that passed through 20 mouths could be altered by 20 intentions, but a gesture, one shared look, was pure and untraceable. This was how alliances formed in the palace, not with oaths or contracts, but with the slow weaving of trust, thread by silent thread. Cheng, still only a minor attendant, began to experiment. Once, while serving tea to the emperor and a visiting minister, he let his sleeve fall just so, revealing for a heartbeat the embroidered pattern of a gift the minister had sent months earlier. The minister's eyes lit with recognition. The emperor, seeing nothing unusual, continued speaking. Days later, the minister's nephew appeared with a basket of lychees for the servants' enjoyment. In the Forbidden City, such moments were gold. A eunuch could not own land, pass down a family name, or leave children to carry his memory, but he could, in these small ways, make himself remembered in the living hearts of those who mattered. And once remembered, he could be useful. And once useful, perhaps even dangerous. For Cheng, the language of the palace was no longer a mystery. It was a tool. And like any tool, it could be used to build, or to carve away at the foundations of power itself. Life in the Forbidden City was often compared to living inside a jewel box, glittering on the outside, suffocating within. For the eunuchs, it was both a privilege and a prison. They lived closer to the emperor than most of his ministers, but that closeness was not freedom, it was a set of invisible chains, spun from duty, loyalty, and fear. Cheng began to understand this as the seasons cycled through the palace gardens. In spring, when the peonies in the imperial courtyard opened, the court ladies would stroll in embroidered slippers while eunuchs trailed behind with parasols. In summer, when the air shimmered with heat, eunuchs would fan the emperor during his afternoon readings, their arms aching but their faces expressionless. In autumn, when the chrysanthemums were arranged in the Hall of Tranquil Longevity, eunuchs worked through the night to ensure every blossom faced the same way for the morning inspection. And in winter, when snow lay like porcelain on the tiled roofs, they would sweep the walkways before dawn so that the emperor's feet would never touch ice. It was an existence defined by constant readiness. A eunuch's time was never his own. At any moment, a bell could ring in the distance, a signal from the inner court, and whatever he was doing would be abandoned instantly. The emperor might want tea, or a new robe, or a messenger dispatched to the Ministry of War. The reason never mattered, obedience was absolute. But the palace's control went deeper than commands. Movement was regulated by rank. A junior eunuch like Chang could not enter certain corridors unless summoned. The southern gates were watched day and night, not only to keep enemies out, but to keep servants, especially eunuchs, in. Even letters sent home were inspected, and sometimes rewritten, by higher-ranking eunuchs who acted as the palace's unseen censors. This control bred a peculiar kind of loyalty, part gratitude, part dependence. The palace fed them better than many peasants could dream of. They wore silk uniforms in a time when farmers wore hemp rags. They lived under roofs of golden tiles while floods and famine ravaged the countryside. Yet, they could not leave without permission, and their every comfort was contingent on their usefulness. The emperor's favor was the most gilded chain of all. To be noticed by the Son of Heaven was to rise, to be ignored was to wither in obscurity. But favor was fickle. One winter, a fellow eunuch named Lu Hong was chosen to accompany the emperor on a hunting expedition beyond the palace walls, a rare honor. He returned with gifts, a silver belt buckle, and whispers of promotion. By summer, a single misplaced word in the Empress Dowager's presence sent him to manage the imperial pigsties, where his silk robes soon reeked of filth. For Chang, the lesson was clear: the palace offered rewards only so long as you remained in its service. Even the most exalted eunuch was a servant first, and servants were disposable. And yet, in this tightly controlled world, ambition still found ways to grow. The palace was full of invisible ladders, opportunities to rise, not through public merit, but through private usefulness. If you remembered the emperor's favorite tea blend, or a concubine's preferred incense, or the Empress Dowager's old grievance against a certain minister, you became more than a servant. You became someone worth keeping. It was Gao Shan who put it into words one night as they walked the empty Hall of Union, the great bronze clepsydra marking the passing hours. In here, Cheng, we are birds in a golden cage. We cannot fly away. But if you sing the right song, the hand that holds the cage will feed you first. Cheng listened carefully. Outside the palace walls, he would have been a farmer's son with callous hands, laboring under the sun. Inside, he was a man without a man's body, yet standing at the elbow of the most powerful person in the empire. He could not leave. But perhaps, if he learned the right songs, he would not need to. The golden cage was still a cage. But the silk chains that bound him could also be threads to climb. Night in the Forbidden City was never truly silent. Even after the last lanterns dimmed in the outer courts, and the ministers had left through the Meridian Gate, the air seemed to hum with whispers carried along the covered walkways. It was in these hours, between the duties of the day and the ceremonies of the dawn, that the true politics of the palace breathed. By day, eunuchs bowed, served tea, polished jade screens, and stood wordless at the edges of great halls. By night, they became messengers of secrets. Within the maze of vermilion corridors, a nod to a certain guard, a gift of candied plums to the night watch, or a slow stroll past a locked gate could be all it took to pass a message without ever speaking aloud. Ching had begun to notice a pattern. Certain eunuchs always seemed to linger in particular courtyards at night, far from their assigned quarters. Others made regular trips to the imperial wardrobe, but returned with bundles that bulged in ways no robe should. Gao Shan explained that these were not accidents, these were networks. Some eunuchs acted as discreet couriers between the emperor's favored concubines, carrying words that could not be trusted to paper. Others smuggled items in and out of the palace, rare medicines, forbidden charms, even the occasional letter from a high official to a court lady whose family could influence policy. These networks thrived because of the palace's strict hierarchies. No minister could stroll into the women's quarters, No concubine could walk to the hall of supreme harmony, and no imperial prince could linger in the Empress Dowager's private chambers without notice. But eunuchs could. They moved between worlds like shadows, belonging everywhere and nowhere. It was in this world of shadows that Chang was first approached. One autumn evening, while returning from delivering tea to the emperor's study, he passed through the garden of benevolent tranquility. The moon was high, casting silver light over the carved balustrades. From behind a rockery, a soft voice called, "Little Chang." It was Eunuch Zhao, a man with narrow eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. He spoke without preamble. "Tomorrow morning, the emperor will attend the ritual at the Temple of Heavenly Purity. You will carry the ceremonial lantern, yes?" Chang nodded cautiously. "When you light it," Zhao continued, "make sure it burns a little brighter than usual. The emperor will notice. He will think the Empress Dowager ordered extra oil for the occasion. That is all." It sounded harmless. But Chang knew enough to understand that even the smallest details in the palace could ripple outward. A brighter lantern at a ritual could be interpreted as an act of respect, a sign of reconciliation, or a subtle reminder of someone's presence in court affairs. He did as asked. The next day, the emperor glanced at the lantern, then at the Empress Dowager, who smiled faintly. Later, Chang heard that the Empress Dowager's stipend for her personal staff had been quietly increased. From that moment, whispers began to follow him. A scrap of advice in passing. A request to delay a message by half an hour. A suggestion to serve tea at a slightly lower temperature so the emperor would sip slower and linger longer in a certain hall. None of these actions seemed treasonous. But together, they formed a web of influence, each strand invisible until it pulled tight. Gao Shan warned him one night, "Every whisper here comes with a price. Sometimes you pay in coin, sometimes in blood. Make sure you know which before you agree." Yet, Chang found himself drawn to this undercurrent. In the daylight world of the Forbidden City, rank and ceremony were fixed like carved stone. But in the shadow world, even a low-ranking eunuch could tip the balance between two rival factions without leaving a trace. It was a dangerous game. But it was also the only game in the palace where someone like Chang could hope to win. The first time Chang realized he was being watched by the emperor himself, it happened in the most ordinary of moments. He was pouring tea in the hall of mental cultivation, the autumn wind rattling the silk blinds, when he felt a sudden weight behind the emperor's gaze, sharp, measuring, as though Chang were not merely serving, but performing a test. In that instant, Chang understood something fundamental. In the Forbidden City, the emperor did not speak only through decrees. He studied, weighed, and silently marked the worth of every person who entered his sight. Most courtiers and ministers saw the emperor for mere moments, during formal audiences. Eunuchs, however, were in his presence daily, sometimes for hours at a time. A trusted eunuch could become more than a servant, he could become an extension of the emperor's will, a human channel for imperial thought. Eunuch Zhao had hinted at this once, "We serve with our hands, but we rise with our ears." To have the emperor's ear meant more than hearing his words. It meant knowing when not to repeat them, when to soften them, when to make them vanish before they reached dangerous ears. One evening, Chang was assigned to attend a private meeting between the emperor and his grand secretariat. The ministers spoke of grain shortages in the south, of border tensions in the west. Chang said nothing, moved silently, refilled cups, adjusted incense sticks. Yet, the next morning, when the emperor asked for a certain memorandum, he looked to Chang rather than his chief clerk. It was the one placed on the left of the jade paperweight. "Last night," Chang replied without hesitation. That small exchange became the first thread of trust. Soon, the emperor began asking Chang quiet, almost offhand questions. what time a certain prince had left the palace the night before, whether a concubine had seemed ill at the banquet, whether the rain had stopped in the outer courtyard. Questions that were not truly about weather or health, but about observation, about whether Ching could notice without being told to notice. The more the emperor asked, the more Ching realized he was being tested for discretion. A less careful eunuch might have let slip a tone of judgment, or revealed too much eagerness. Ching instead cultivated the art of answering fully while revealing nothing of himself. The emperor's face never betrayed whether he approved, but the assignments he received began to change. He was sent to deliver a sealed letter to the commander of the imperial guard, alone, without escort. He was ordered to accompany the emperor to the ancestral temple at dawn, carrying the ancestral tablets in their silk wrappings. These were tasks that required both trust and silence, for a single misplaced word could ignite court rumors. And with each new duty, Ching felt his place in the palace shifting. Ministers who once ignored him now nodded as he passed. Concubines whispered his name to their own attendants. Even among the eunuchs, there was a new carefulness in how they spoke to him. But the emperor's ear was not only a source of favor, it was a dangerous weight to bear. Gao Shan's warning echoed in Chang's mind, to hold the ear of the Son of Heaven is to hold a blade by its edge. One wrong word, and it will turn against you. Late one night, as Ching extinguished the last lamp in the hall of mental cultivation, he thought of the other eunuchs who had once been favored, their names now erased from palace registers, their fates whispered about in the kitchens. He would tread carefully. But he also knew, once the emperor began to listen to you, you could never go back to being invisible. The war for influence in the Forbidden City was often fought not in the audience hall, but in the inner court, among the lacquered screens, perfumed chambers, and silken corridors where the emperor's consorts lived. It was here that eunuchs became more than attendants, they became envoys, spies, and sometimes even matchmakers in the quiet wars between women of the harem. For the emperor's affection was not simply a matter of the heart, it was a political prize. A favored consort's family might gain lucrative appointments, military commands, or the right to collect taxes from rich provinces. Her rivals would see their influence wither. And so, every glance, every gift, every whispered word became a move on the chessboard of the inner court. Ching learned this truth when he was transferred temporarily to the service of noble consort E. Her apartments in the Palace of Eternal Spring smelled faintly of jasmine and sandalwood, a calculated choice, sweet enough to linger in memory, yet not so heavy as to seem overpowering. Every detail in her chambers was deliberate, the fresh peonies brought daily from the imperial gardens, the lacquered hairpins that caught the candlelight just so. Her chief eunuch, an elderly man named San He, wasted no time in explaining Chang's role. "You will prepare the tea for the emperor's evening visits," he said, "and you will time it so the fragrance reaches him before the first sip." It seemed trivial, until Ching understood that the fragrance of the tea was laced with a rare orchid essence known to soothe fatigue. The emperor, already worn by state affairs, would associate that sense of calm with noble consort Yi's presence. But the consort's rivals were just as cunning. One night, as Ching carried a tray toward her chambers, he was intercepted by a eunuch in crimson robes, who politely offered to assist. Ching declined. Later, he discovered that the tea leaves on his tray had been subtly swapped, replaced with a bitter variety that would have left an unpleasant aftertaste. The sabotage extended beyond tea. Perfume satchels went missing. Candles burned with an odd, acrid scent. Music for the emperor's evening entertainment was altered so that the zither strings would sound slightly off-tune. These were not accidents, they were skirmishes in an unending campaign to tarnish a rival's image in the emperor's mind. Eunuchs became both weapons and shields in these battles. A trusted attendant could ensure that the right robe was laid out for the right occasion, that a letter from a family member reached the consort's hands without interception, or that a rumor in the servants' quarters was quietly smothered before it reached the inner court. Chang's own test came during the Mid-Autumn Festival. Noble Consort Yi had arranged a moonlit banquet for the emperor, with rare lychee fruit brought all the way from Guangdong. Hours before the event, the lychees vanished. Sun Yi's face went pale. Without them, the banquet would lose its most memorable flourish. Ching acted quickly. He slipped out to the kitchens, bartered with the chief cook for a hidden store of candied lotus seeds, and arranged them in a silver dish shaped like a crescent moon. When the emperor arrived, he smiled at the sight, remarking that it reminded him of his childhood. Noble Consort Yi caught Chang's eye from across the table, her expression unreadable, but later that night, he found a small pouch of silver in his quarters. That was the way of the inner court's hidden wars: no banners, no armies, only fragrance, silk, and the quiet maneuvering of those who understood that the smallest details could tip the balance of power. Chang had survived his first skirmish. But he knew the war never truly ended. By now, Ching understood that the Forbidden City never truly slept. When the outer gates closed at dusk, the city within came alive in a different way, footsteps padding down darkened galleries, paper lanterns bobbing like floating embers, voices pitched low to avoid echoing in the still air. It was in these hours that the most dangerous exchanges occurred. Messages passed between chambers, hidden in folded robes or tucked beneath tea trays. Secret lovers met under the pretense of a late summons. Eunuchs ferried information from one faction to another, their loyalty as fluid as the coins slipped into their sleeves. Chang's duties often kept him awake deep into the night, and he learned to recognize the patterns of movement. The hurrying shuffle of a minor eunuch bearing an urgent note. The deliberate, slow tread of the imperial guards patrolling the courtyards. The whisper of silk from a concubine's robes, moving quickly through a passage she was not meant to use. One night, as he made his way back from delivering an herbal tonic to the Empress Dowager, Ching noticed a flicker of light at the far end of the eastern long corridor, a place that should have been deserted. His instincts told him to turn away. In the palace, curiosity could be fatal. But something about the scene, a eunuch he did not recognize, speaking in hushed tones to a man in plain scholar's robes, rooted him in place. The man handed over a small bamboo tube, the kind used to store documents. The eunuch bowed deeply before slipping away into the shadows. Ching waited until the light vanished, then moved on, his heart pounding. He told no one. Days later, the emperor summoned a high-ranking censor for questioning over a leaked memorial that had embarrassed the court. Ching made no connection aloud, but in his mind, he saw again the bamboo tube changing hands. He began to notice more. A consort's attendant leading the palace with an embroidered pouch far heavier than it should be. A guard accepting a folded piece of paper in exchange for letting a delivery cart pass without inspection. The palace was a sealed world, but the walls were not as impermeable as they seemed. And yet, the greatest danger did not come from discovering these secrets, it came from being known as someone who noticed them. Once others realized that Cheng was observant, they began testing him. A eunuch from the western kitchen casually asked if Cheng had seen the emperor visit the Hall of Literary Brilliance that morning. A maid from the Palace of Great Benevolence pressed him about whether a certain minister's nephew had been in the gardens. Each time, Cheng deflected with a mild, vague answer, never confirming nor denying. The skill was not merely in keeping secrets, it was in convincing others you had none to keep. But the palace had a way of drawing even the careful into its web. One night, a folded note appeared under Chang's pillow. No signature. Only a single line, written in a steady hand. You see much, and speak little. That can be useful. He stared at it for a long time, the silence of the night pressing in. Whoever had left it knew where he slept. And in the Forbidden City, an invitation was never truly a choice. Loyalty in the Forbidden City was never pure, it was a currency, and like all currencies, its value shifted depending on who held it and what they were willing to pay. For a eunuch, loyalty could mean safeguarding the emperor's private words, shielding a consort from scandal, or quietly removing a rival from their post. But it could just as easily mean betraying one master to serve another, if that master's star was rising. The great paradox was that betrayal, in the right moment, could itself be an act of loyalty to survival. Qing learned this truth when the inner court was shaken by an unexpected scandal. Noble consort Yi's younger brother, a provincial governor, was accused of embezzling silver mint for flood relief in the south. The charges were serious enough that her position was suddenly in jeopardy. Rumors spread like fire in dry grass. Some whispered that her family had long been corrupt, others that the accusations were fabricated by her rivals. Sun He, her chief eunuch, summoned Qing to a closed meeting in her private hall. The flickering lamplight carved deep lines into Sun He's face. "You have served well," he said, "and I trust you. The consort needs evidence, anything, that can discredit these accusations before they reach the emperor's ears in full force." The request was clear: find a way to make the governor's accuser look unreliable. Qing knew the risk. If he succeeded, he would bind himself to noble consort Yi's faction. If he failed, he would be marked as her accomplice in a failed cover-up. He chose to act. Over the next 2 nights, he navigated the palace's hidden veins, kitchen passages, service corridors, the little-used moon gate that led to the record halls. There, after hours of quiet searching, he found a document that caught his breath, a report signed by the very official accusing the governor, praising his past service and integrity. Dated barely 2 years earlier, it was proof that the accuser's stance had shifted sharply and suspiciously. Qing presented the scroll to Sun He, who accepted it with a thin smile. Within days, the accusation against the governor was publicly dismissed as a misunderstanding. Noble consort Yi's influence held firm, her rivals chastened, for the moment. But Qing noticed something troubling. From that day forward, Sun He began introducing him to others, stewards of supply warehouses, senior eunuchs in the emperor's service, even a minister's scribe. Each meeting came with the same subtle message: you can trust this one. It was not trust that concerned Qing, it was ownership. Every favor he granted, every secret he carried, wove a tighter net around him. And in the palace, the one who owed too many debts became someone else's property in all but name. The turning point came when an emissary from the Imperial Household Department quietly handed Qing a pouch of gold leaves, along with a note. For services rendered, and for future silence. He left the pouch untouched on his table that night. By morning, it was gone, not stolen, but removed. Whoever had given it had also taken it back, perhaps as a warning: loyalty, once offered, could never be withdrawn without consequence. Qing realized then that the true price of loyalty in the Forbidden City was not silver, nor gold, it was freedom. And it was a price he had already begun to pay. In the Forbidden City, survival was often less about strength or cunning than about knowing when, and how, to disappear. Qing first saw this art in practice when an older eunuch named Qiu suddenly ceased to exist in the daily life of the palace. Qiu had once been everywhere, delivering messages for the Imperial Household Department, mediating disputes in the kitchens, attending the Empress Dowager during morning audiences. Then, without warning, his presence dissolved. He did not vanish physically. Qing would sometimes glimpse him sweeping a remote courtyard or tending a lotus pond at the far end of the gardens of benevolent tranquility. But Qiu no longer spoke of court matters, no longer lingered in busy corridors. It was as if the palace had collectively decided to forget him. Qing asked no questions. He understood the unspoken truth: Qiu had been too close to a power that had fallen. His former master's disgrace had threatened to drag him down, and so he had erased himself from the story before anyone could write his name into it. Disappearance could take many forms. Sometimes it was physical, asking for reassignment to remote storerooms or the outer gardens. Sometimes it was social, speaking only when spoken to, refusing to be drawn into gossip, letting one's face fade into the crowd. The most skilled could vanish in plain sight, present but unremarkable, until they were no longer remembered as potential allies or threats. Qing began to practice this art himself. After the incident with noble consort Yi's brother, he quietly withdrew from certain circles. He declined invitations to late-night meetings, avoided carrying messages that might involve factional disputes, and volunteered for routine but low-profile duties, arranging incense for the ancestral rites, cataloging ceremonial robes. It was during this period of calculated invisibility that he overheard a conversation that chilled him. Two eunuchs from the emperor's private apartments were speaking in coded language, but the meaning was clear enough. Someone in the household department was suspected of leaking supply inventories to an outside faction. The punishment for such a leak was severe, public flogging at best, execution at worst. The name they did not speak hung between their words like smoke. Qing realized with a cold twist in his stomach that it was his own. That night, he followed Qiu's example more fully. He moved his sleeping mat to an unused servant's alcove, altered his daily route to avoid the main corridors, and made certain that, for several days, no one could say exactly where he had been at any given time. He left no trace of his own movements, and no one caught him in a place that could tie him to the accusations. By the time the household department's investigation concluded, suspicion had shifted elsewhere. A younger eunuch, careless with his associations, was quietly removed from his post. Qing had survived again, not by confrontation, but by subtraction. In the Forbidden City, absence could be the most powerful form of presence. Even in its stillest moments, the Forbidden City was never truly silent. Beneath the formal words of imperial edicts and the measured steps of court ceremony, there was always a quieter current, whispers that darted like minnows in dark water, invisible unless you knew where to look. Qing had learned by now that in the palace, whispers were not idle gossip. They were a currency more volatile than gold, traded in hallways, tea rooms, and the shaded alcoves behind carved screens. One rumor could elevate a concubine to the emperor's favor, another could send a minister's family into disgrace. One winter morning, as frost clung to the tiled roofs and the plum blossoms in the courtyards bowed under their icy weight, Qing was summoned to deliver silk bolts to the Hall of Mental Cultivation. It was the emperor's personal residence, where he spent long nights poring over memorials and meeting with trusted advisors. While waiting for an attendant to receive the goods, Qing paused near a half-open lattice door. From inside came voices, low but urgent. "The treasury cannot sustain this campaign," one said. "The southern provinces are already strained. The emperor believes the rebellion must be crushed before spring," another interrupted. "If the supply lines falter, we lose more than silver." The conversation ended abruptly when footsteps approached. Qing bowed low as an official passed, pretending to be absorbed in adjusting the silk bundles. But the fragments of their exchange clung to his mind. A rebellion in the south? The court bulletins had spoken only of minor unrest. If the truth was being kept quiet, it meant the emperor feared the news would weaken his hold. Over the next days, the whispers multiplied. Eunuchs spoke of hurried orders to the armories, of grain requisitions that emptied granaries in 3 provinces. Even the kitchen schedules changed. Meals for the emperor grew simpler, suggesting either austerity or a desire to project it. Qing resisted the temptation to repeat what he heard. He knew too well that a whisper passed on was no longer a possession but a liability. Instead, he began to watch who sought out the information and who avoided it. He noticed that certain eunuchs in the imperial household department were spending more time near the outer courtyards, where military couriers arrived. Others, particularly those aligned with the Empress Dowager, seemed unusually calm, as if they knew the outcome before it had even begun. One evening, as he lit the lanterns along the covered walkways, Qing overheard two senior eunuchs in the Empress Dowager's service. "If the campaign fails, she will be ready," one said softly. "And she has more allies than he realizes." It struck Qing then that the rebellion in the south was not just a military matter, it was a political lever. The Empress Dowager's faction might use a defeat to weaken the emperor's authority. In the shadows of the Dragon Throne, even war could be a tool for palace intrigue. He returned to his quarters with the realization that whispers in the Forbidden City were never truly harmless. Each one carried the weight of unseen hands, pulling at the balance of power. And in the dragon's shadow, even the faintest murmur could become a roar. By the 13th year of the Yongle reign, Qing had served in the palace long enough to understand a truth outsiders rarely grasped: the emperor was not one man, but many. The figure who presided over grand audiences, flanked by gold dragons and ministers in their ceremonial robes, was not the same man who dined quietly in the hall of mental cultivation or wandered the private gardens at dusk. To the officials, he was the Son of Heaven, remote, infallible, cloaked in the language of decrees. To the Empress, he was the husband she was expected to revere, but rarely saw alone. To his concubines, he might be a source of favor or a cold absence. To his eunuchs, he could be mercurial, smiling one morning, ordering a flogging the next. Qing's first personal encounter with the emperor came not in the grand audience hall, but in the small hours of the night. He had been delivering a sealed tea caddy to the imperial study when the door opened, and there he was, not robed in yellow silk, but in plain indigo, his hair unbound, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. "You are new," the emperor had said, though Qing had been in service for 2 years by then. "Yes, your majesty," Qing replied, kneeling. The emperor studied him for a moment, then gestured to a pile of scrolls. "Do you read?" "A little, your majesty." "Then tell me, what does this say?" He handed over a memorial written in a hurried, slanting hand. Qing scanned the first lines. It was a plea from a provincial governor for relief after a flood. The emperor took it back without comment, but something in his expression shifted. Perhaps he was testing how much his servants could grasp, or perhaps he wanted to see if they dared to look beyond their station. From that night on, Qing noticed how carefully the emperor managed his appearances. At morning court, he sat motionless, speaking only when the ritual demanded it. In private meetings, he could be brisk and calculating, dismissing proposals with a flick of the hand. But there were rare moments, passing glimpses, that revealed the man behind the mask, a hand lingering over a map of the southern provinces, as if tracing the line of an unspoken worry, a deep breath before reading a memorial about famine, a faint smile when a rare letter from his childhood tutor arrived. The palace taught everyone to wear masks, but the emperor's was the heaviest. Qing began to suspect that the constant performance was not only for the benefit of the court but for survival. Even the Son of Heaven could be surrounded by enemies, and any sign of uncertainty might invite a challenge. One evening, Qing overheard an exchange between the emperor and the chief eunuch, Li Shan. "They are waiting for you to falter," Li said quietly. "Then they will wait a long time," the emperor replied, his tone hard as jade. Qing bowed in the shadows, unseen. He understood then that the emperor's mask was not simply a facade, it was armor. And like all armor, it came at a cost. For years, Li Shan had been a fixture in the palace, tall, spare, with a gaze that could pin even the most arrogant minister into silence. As chief eunuch, his word could alter the course of a career, his nod could decide which petition reached the emperor's hands. He had served 3 reigns, outliving rivals and sidestepping every trap. Some whispered he was untouchable. Qing once admired Li Shan from afar. The man seemed the embodiment of palace mastery, knowing everything, revealing nothing. It was Li who had placed Qing in his first post outside the imperial kitchens, giving him his first taste of work that touched the emperor's personal life. That quiet promotion had shaped Qing's path. But in the Yonhe court, longevity bred envy. By the 14th year, subtle signs began to appear, delays in Li's orders, petitions that bypassed him entirely, officials requesting audiences without his knowledge. Qing, now experienced enough to read the palace's shifting currents, sensed the slow tightening of a net. The blow came in spring, announced not in public humiliation but in absence. One morning, Li Shan did not appear at the daily briefing in the Hall of Mental Cultivation. His seat was empty. The following day, the chief clerk informed the household department that Li had been reassigned to the archives office for special records in the Western Repository, a post so obscure it was essentially exile. No reason was given, but the whispers filled the void. Some claimed he had been caught accepting bribes from foreign envoys, others that he had interfered in the emperor's appointment of a new military governor. A more chilling rumor said the Empress Dowager herself had engineered his fall, weary of his influence over her son. Qing caught only one glimpse of him afterward. Li was walking slowly along the covered corridor toward the western courtyards, a small lacquered chest in his hands. The man who had once moved like a coiled bowstring now seemed heavier, each step deliberate. When his eyes met Qing's, there was no plea, no explanation, only a flicker of something that might have been warning. In the weeks that followed, the palace adjusted with unnerving speed. The new chief eunuch, a younger man named Zhao Wen, began consolidating control, replacing Li's allies with his own. The routines shifted. Orders came in sharper tones. Qing learned to answer more quickly, to bow more deeply. But late at night, as he passed the darkened corridors of the Western Repository, he sometimes thought of Li Shan alone among the dust-covered ledgers, the secrets of the empire sleeping in brittle scrolls. Perhaps, Qing thought, the man had not been defeated entirely, only moved to a quieter battlefield. In the Forbidden City, a fall did not always mean the end. Sometimes it was the beginning of a different kind of game. Years passed, and Chang's hair, once black as lacquer, began to show the first threads of silver. He had learned to walk the palace with the calm of someone who knew both its beauty and its dangers. He had survived purges, famines, and even the Southern Rebellion, which had ended in a quiet settlement the court never publicly acknowledged. He had also learned the greatest truth of eunuch life: power was not always in the loudest commands or the grandest offices. Sometimes it lived in the smallest, quietest acts, the placement of a letter where it would be seen, the choice to withhold a piece of news until the right moment, the ability to pass through rooms without leaving a trace. By the 17th year of the Yonhe reign, Qing had risen to oversee the Imperial Tea Bureau, a post that seemed unremarkable to outsiders. But the tea he selected, stored, and presented reached the emperor's lips daily. A note tucked into the wrappings, a subtle change in supplier, the timing of delivery, all could carry meaning. He no longer sought to climb higher. He had seen too many men like Li Shan, whose fall was as swift as their rise. Instead, Qing cultivated an invisible influence, moving like water, essential but unnoticed. One autumn evening, as the lanterns were being lit and the air carried the scent of osmanthus, Qing was summoned unexpectedly to the Hall of Mental Cultivation. The emperor was alone, seated by a brazier, a cup of tea in his hands. "You've served me for many years," the emperor said without looking up. "I wonder, have you ever wanted more?" Qing bowed low. "To serve faithfully is enough, Your Majesty." The emperor studied him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. Good. Those who want too much rarely last. He sipped his tea, and Cheng understood the conversation was over. That night, walking back to his quarters, Cheng passed the Western Repository. Its windows were dark, its doors closed. He thought of Li Shun again, and wondered whether the man was still alive within those walls, or whether he, too, had become part of the palace's silent memory. Years later, when Cheng's own time came to leave service, there was no ceremony, no farewell audience. He simply stepped out through the Meridian Gate with the other retirees, carrying a single chest of belongings. To those outside, he was just another old eunuch, one of many who had passed through the palace's endless halls. But inside the Forbidden City, the tea continued to be poured at precisely the right temperature, the memorials delivered at exactly the right moment, and the whispers flowing just as they always had. Cheng had left, but the quietest power he had learned to wield was already in other hands. The palace endured, and the shadows lengthened, as they always did.